All coaches aspire to be champions, and this time of year is when you set that vision for your team. By now, listeners of this podcast know about signature championship rings and have met some of the signature champion coaches who partner with them to celebrate their achievements. Reputable, affordable, first-class customer service are just some of the ways we keep hearing coaches describe signature championship rings. So as you're ramping up this summer for the upcoming season, create a championship vision for your team now using the design tool at sigaturechampions.com/podcast. Give your team a visual to motivate their pursuit of a championship in 2024. And when your team has a championship moment to celebrate, we highly recommend consulting with Signature Championship Rings.
We're going inside them. We're going outside them. Inside them, outside them. Fight, 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 fight. What do you say, man?
Thing to do isn't to punch them, isn't to talk to them. There's only one way you get respect, and that's by looking somebody in the eye for 60 minutes.
It was a great game for college football.
And Notre Dame is going to go for 2 points. They're going to try to win it. Steenberg is going back to throw. He throws the end zone. It's caught by Rooney. Notre Dame has taken the lead over Purdue.
Rather than why me, why not me? And so here it is. If you believe you can. So just do it.
Our conversation this week on Kileleni to the Summit is with former Pittsburgh Steeler Rocky Bleier. Now, as a Cleveland Brown myself, I'm going to tell this story, and I'm going to tell it quietly, but for a while when I was young, probably around 8 years old, I was a closet Pittsburgh Steelers fan, and a lot of it was the team my dad coached. Their uniforms closely resembled the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, they weren't black and gold, but instead of black, they had this very dark blue, but their uniforms were exactly like the Steelers, so I started to like the Steelers for a little bit, and loved the era with Rocky Bleier and just some really hard-nosed players. An incredible human being. Went to the United States, military, served in Vietnam, won a Purple Heart. An incredible story. And while originally I'd focused on some episodes you had with coaches, I just couldn't get away from this one. I listened to it multiple times and really excited to hear about your relationship, Patrick, with Rocky Bleier, who coincidentally was at the Pittsburgh Playbook Clinics that both you and I were at.
Yeah, Rocky is just a unique man in many ways and become a very dear friend. And yeah, I invited him to come to that clinic when I was asked if I could speak at the clinic, and there were a number of the Playbook clinics right around the country throughout the winter. I picked the Pittsburgh one mainly because I knew Rocky would be there when I found out, he lives there and works there and is a prominent member. So I was glad to have dinner with him and have him speak to everybody there. But my first memory of Rocky Bleier was the 1966 first game of the century for some of the elderly guys in our audience. Notre Dame, Michigan State 10-10 tie, where he was the running back for the University of Notre Dame. And then, so they won the national championship that year. In 67, he was the team captain, was drafted in the very last round. He told me there were 16 rounds, and he was the very last pick of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And when they asked Dan Rooney, the owner, why he picked Rocky Bleier as the last pick. And he said, well, he's a Catholic kid, went to Notre Dame. He's the last pick. He's probably never going to play, so why not pick him, And he got on there, played, was on their practice squad. Back then they had those, that's what they called their kind of guys trying to work their way onto the team. And then in the fall, he got drafted by the U.S. Army. And that was at the height of Vietnam. And he did not try to get out, but he went to Vietnam, served our country, ended up having a landmine in his foxhole that blew off part of his foot, was shot in the knee, 5 different surgeries, came back, and I saw him. I was a freshman at Notre Dame at the pep rally for the USC game. And here came this young man with 2 crutches hobbling up the steps and it was Rocky Bleier. He had just come back from his surgeries in the Philippines, and he gave just one of the most dynamic pep rally talks I've ever heard and seen. Got to know him over the years at various Notre Dame alumni things, and then he served as honorary chairman for the Catholic Bowl the first year I did that here in Dallas, and just a great, great man. If you don't know his story, ESPN did a 30 for 30 on him a few years back called The Return, and they took him, producer John Fish took him back to Vietnam to that same field where he got in the firefight and was injured, and it's a moving piece. His book, Fighting Back, is well worth a read for everybody. So really a pleasure to have Rocky Bleier.
Yeah, this one is, again, full of takeaways, I think, about just being a leader, overcoming adversity, so many different things. And we're excited to share it here. We'll be back at the end of this for our Winning Edge takeaways. Here's Patrick's conversation with Rocky Bleier. As coaches, we know that some of the biggest hurdles to our team's success can come from off the field. Your team needs support to tackle the endless list of expenses, uniforms, training equipment, travel, and more. But raising that money can feel like a full-time job. Thankfully, there's Vertical Raise. Vertical Raise is the premier online fundraising platform using innovative technology to create the easiest and most efficient system available. Raise more money in less time with a local fundraising coach who works with your team every step of the way to customize the ideal fundraiser. With options for online donations, digital discount cards, premium product sales, and even spirit shops, Vertical Raise has top-of-the-line solutions for every fundraising style. To find out more, visit verticalraise.com and we'll get you connected with an exclusive offer on your first fundraiser.
Welcome, friends. This is Patrick Steenberg, founder and president of Global Football, and your host for the podcast. Today, I've got a man that many of you may know his stories and his life, but I'm sure there's some things we don't know that we're going to dig into today. Welcome to Rocky Bleier. Rock, where do I find you today?
Hey, Patrick. Thanks. It's nice to hear your voice. You find me in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, locked into my house, in my office, now very talking to you. So thank you for the call. Get me out of my rut that I'm in. So this is good.
Hey, it's a pleasure, Rock, especially being a Western PA boy myself. Grew up in Erie. It's always fun to talk to somebody from that part of the country. We're going to talk for about a half hour here and get into a couple different subjects. But, you know, your life has been so full of experiences, so full of stories, so full of lessons. I want to just touch on kind of a few highlights, if that's all right, with a focus on, I think, team. As I read about everything you've done, it seems to center around teams. So if you don't mind, let me ask a few items there. When you were growing up as a young guy in Wisconsin, can you think back to a team, a mentor, somebody there who really had an influence in developing that part of your life?
Well, yes, I can. But the great thing about teams, it's really a learning process, as we all have learned, you as well, and through a period of time, whether it be organized teams and or pickup teams, because I think it's something that today's skill set has been lost to some degree when you're trying to pick up a game in the neighborhood and who's playing on who, and you got odd number of people. And so now you got to make your own rules. You got to select who's going to be on what team or the other team. Sometimes it's not always fair, but you work out who's going to be up first, what teams, what side. And I think part of that process is obviously lost. And I always think about teams in the context of working together. You get each other's back, you get your own assignment, but how it flows with other people on the team, whether it be basketball or whether it be football or soccer or whatever sport you might be playing. So along those lines, you learn, and then you hopefully have a good fortune to have maybe one catalyst or one mentor or one coach that makes all the difference in the world to you. And that happened to be during that period of time, my high school coach, a guy by the name of Torchy Clark, who was a consistent winner. Now, we have to go back in time to the baby boomer era, latter part of the 50s, Torchy was a grade school basketball coach in his grade school, which was a rival grade school to the one I attended, had always won the grade school conference, and primarily because of him and his teaching skills. But secondly, as now we expand, new schools are being built, new high schools back in 58, 59, and 60. And Torchy then becomes the head coach at the new Catholic high school in Appleton, Wisconsin. And so he then becomes my coach. And along those lines, it's the impact that he had, how he approached the game. They didn't nickname him Torchy for nothing.
I was wondering.
That's right. I mean, he had a quick temper. He demanded excellence. He was a slightly built basketball player himself. He played at Marquette. And his whole process and his whole philosophy was full court press, half court press, zone press, fast breaks off to the side, up the middle. It was a fast paced game, no set plays. And he demanded you to be in that position and know how to run the floor when you're there. He was our football coach as well. So I had both sports, basketball and football with him. And he was the kind of guy that knew when to pat you on the back, also knew when to kick you in the rear end or yell and scream. And so it always, it always made a difference. It was an interesting thing. He'd be sitting in the bleachers coaching. So he was the pride and joy of the brand new high school, and we were winning some games and all the excitement, but he had a temper when things weren't going well. And he would kick the bench. He'd kick the bench to make a point. And sometimes his verbiage wasn't very Catholic-like, especially in the Catholic school. And so the good nuns who would come to watch the game and support their Catholic school, who taught on the other side of the school, the girls it was a Christian Brothers, and I forgot the denomination for the nuns. But anyway, so they would sit around Torchy talking. And as the season, and then as the years went by, they sat further and further and further away from him. So anyway, so at that period of time, he was a big influence just from a confidence point of view, and helping build that confidence in what you can do, can't do, his expectations, and kind of the ball player that you were to become. And so, and he got the most out of all the players, So it was, and I'm going to tell you this, not to brag, but I think it gives a period of time. In that period of time, so, and I'm saying from my sophomore year of high school through my senior year in high school, in the Fox Valley Catholic Conference, and then in the state of Wisconsin, we had lost 4 games in both total, in basketball and in football. We never lost a football game, and we lost 4 games, and the last game that we lost was the state championship my senior year. But because of that, so people got recognized. Yeah. And I just say that people got recognized. He had it was a name team, because you're winning, more people will get recognized from that team. Sure. I have to say there was only 4 guys that went on to play college, anything. Wow. And so for me, it was like a true test of getting the most out of the people at that time, given what you have, and not necessarily talent, but having them reach their potential through that period of time of their life. Not that they would ever go on and play, but you would think, given the success, that you would have great talent all over. But as I said, only 4. So he was the first big influence from a coaching perspective and from a leadership perspective.
Wow, I'd never heard that story of yours. That's a good one. And obviously that was built around a team effort. If you've only got 4 guys ever going to college and you have that much success, that is a total team effort.
Right.
Let's jump ahead. Yeah. 1966, Notre Dame's national championship year, of which you're a key figure. And we all, anybody who's read that history and was around then, the first game of the century, the 10-10 tie at Michigan State. But I want to dive into the next week.
Okay.
Because I want to believe that I don't know. I want to believe there was a little bit of a sense of, boy, did we not achieve it? We were undefeated going in. We end up coming out of there with a 10-10 tie. We got one game left at USC, who's been our nemesis, right?
Forever.
And you got to travel to the coast. You got beat up by Bubba Smith, and Webster and Pisa and all those tough guys from Michigan. How did the team react to going out to Southern Cal for the final game, knowing your only chance to get that national championship is to win out there on the coast?
I would like to tell you the secrets or the inside story of that week of preparation, because it was a big week. I mean, it was a big week coming off that tie, the 10-10 tie. Michigan State obviously was finished with their season. We had the one game left against Southern Cal. Unfortunately, I had a ruptured kidney in the game in Michigan State. And so I spent that week in the hospital back in South Bend. And I missed I missed the preparation. I don't know what took place or what Ara said. The only thing is that I got to watch the game on Saturday from my hospital room and see them win. So I would like to give you inside information. I have no inside information on that game specifically, but as you were saying, I think, and I'm not saying I think, I know this because I've been around that organization during that period of time from, my sophomore year or my freshman year. That junior year was so big. And then ultimately my senior year, is that Ara in his preparation, no matter what the game was, started off each day of that week approaching the game, was so usually you played the game on Saturday, as you well know. Sunday, you review the game, the previous game, Monday, you kind of have a walkthrough practice of some nature, and then we have a little scrimmage, but not too much at the end of the season. But then he starts preparing you for the following week's game. And this one was Southern Cal. It was easy to get up for, but he would start with some little tidbit, some little bit of information that you might not know. Just to not take it for granted, to not take this game for granted, that this is how strong Southern Cal is. This is how many times they beat Michigan State, let's just say, or this is where they are ranked and this is what they've done. And so by the time Thursday and Friday, before we leave to go out to the game, is that you go, holy man, we'll never be able to beat these guys, in this guy. So we don't take anything for granted. And so Ara was a master at being able to do that, at least for my opinion and how I viewed him over the years that he was our head coach, just being able to set the right tone, getting prepared for that game, not blowing the game out of proportion, but putting it into perspective so that, you're ready to play at your top level.
Yeah, I'd say whenever people ask me about Ara, and you went to a much higher level to play in the NFL, but when they ask me what was Ara's secret, I think it was his preparation. I just think he had them scouted so well, and he had our team, our individual, just like you said, we could be playing, the Little Sisters of the Poor on Saturday, and by Thursday afternoon, you were convinced we were going to lose by 50.
That's right. You're right. I tell the same story. You're right. That's the way he did it. I thought one of the other great strengths that Ara had in his leadership was his assistant coaches. Somehow they fit in or bought into the system of what Ara was. And Tom Pagna specifically, who was their backfield coach. Tom was there when you were at Notre Dame. Am I correct?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, fine. And so the week of the game, and when would we get it? We get the letter from the Phantom.
Oh yeah, from the Phantom.
Yes, so it was a letter that we'd get preparing us for the following week's game. That we weren't anybody's, that we weren't anything. We took ourselves so seriously. Blah blah blah. You're not as good as you think you are, and so on. Helping to set up. Maybe the offshoot of what Ara's preparation was. And God, I didn't know where that letter came from until years later that he wrote that letter.
Right.
And anyway, but I thought that all of his support mechanism buying into how practice was run, his philosophy, how he gets things done, and having his assistant coaches just be like their own individuals, but, buying into that whole system.
Yeah, Ara created his team of assistants. Looking back was outstanding, just as he created us of a team of players to where even the special teams members had their uniqueness, right? The special team guys, the prep team, they believed they were as integral to winning as anybody else.
They very much so. And they were as much a part of that success. And Ara made sure, and the assistant coaches made sure that they were as much part of that success. For the listeners out there, and we're talking about walk-on guys. We're talking about guys who played maybe in high school, but didn't get a scholarship, but kind of wanted to be a part of and walked on or other guys that, did get a scholarship, but didn't reach the next plateau. I mean, they're part of the preparation, part of getting the team ready. And Ara did it's a unique leadership job to be able to do that and have those have those people committed to their job of holding the bag, of being on the second team or the third team or the scrub team or the practice team that we're going to scrimmage against, and still be a part of that and still be a part of it years later after graduation, because that becomes their tie to the university and to their experience of their careers and being a part of championship teams and successful seasons. So, that's part of the criteria of a great leader, to be able to do that.
I've always been interested in the use of technology to make our jobs more effective, so I'm excited to continue sharing modern football technology with you here on the podcast. This innovative system leverages tendencies to improve self-scouting, game planning, and in-game decision-making at the speed of the game. Modern football stands out because it's a battle-tested platform used by teams at all levels, like four-time national champion Bishop Gorman, the five-time California state champion Folsom Bulldogs, six-time Texas state champion Lake Travis, Cal football, and the CFL's Grey Cup champions, the Montreal Alouettes. So book a demo today to see why these teams trust modern football technology. Visit www.teammofo.com/demo and mention Coach and Coordinator Podcast, or use the coupon code CC10 to receive 10% off your first year.
I'll tell you another story just from Ara and from my experience.
Sure.
And this is from a leadership point of view. And this was my going into my senior year. And I was going to summer school at the university that summer. And Ara had made mention, he said, one of the things you need to do is to write a letter to all the incoming returning players, welcoming them back to the camp. This is the expectation we have of this year, blah, blah, blah kind of stuff. He said, when you write that, meet with me, and I'd just like to see it before we send it out. And I said, okay, fine. So eventually I wrote the letter in time when it was supposed to go out, and I was walking by the football offices, and I thought, I'll just stop in. It was like noon, lunchtime. And so I stopped in, and Ara was standing in the vestibule outside his office with Tom Pagna and a couple other coaches. And they're just kind of BSing, with one another, telling stories or whatever it is. And I walk in, and Coach Parseghian says, "Oh, hey, Rock, how you doing?" And in his manner, he would grab and shake your hand with one hand. With his right hand, he'd shake your hand. And then with his left hand, he would feel you up. He'd be feeling your arms, your shoulders, your back. It's like, have you been working out? How do you feel? Kind of this. And so he said, how can I help you? And I said, well, Coach, I wrote the letter, and I just thought if you had a minute here, I'd like you to see it. And he said, okay, make an appointment with my secretary. And I go, oh, okay. So I just turned.
Yeah.
And I said to a secretary, when can I see Coach? And she goes, how about tomorrow at the same time? I said, okay, fine. And I learned a lesson there. And the lesson that I learned there is that, could he have taken 5 minutes? Yes. Could he have gone through the letter, without me having come back? Yes. But I didn't set up a meeting. It wasn't protocol. You just don't come in and stop in and take people's time. Although he was there, not doing anything, chatting. And so that's how he kind of run his program. And so it was a lesson I learned well. Now telling you this after all these years.
Yeah, I can imagine just that scene. And when you said you shake his hand, he always did that, and he worked with the quarterbacks quite a bit, as did Coach Pagna. But yeah, he'd shake his hand, and you better have your right shoulder better be tight because he's going to be grabbing with his left hand.
That's right. I know.
You took me right back to those handshakes I would get from him. That's crazy, Rock. That is wild. Talk a little bit about another leader and another great team. You were part of 4 Super Bowl championship teams with the Steelers, just an iconic age there. But their true leader was Dan Rooney, the owner, and who I was very blessed that you introduced me to him back around 2012 before going to Ireland for that event where I got him to do the coin toss for our high school game, thanks to your intro. But tell me a little bit about the Steeler teams and the leadership of Dan Rooney within that, who obviously worked through the coaching staff. But I believe Mr. Rooney was very involved.
If you look over the period of time since 1933, when Mr. Rooney bought a franchise in the fledgling National Football League and was kind of the owner, what people should understand is that for the first 40 years of their existence, the Steelers were the most losingest team in the league. And and obviously it changed later on. But so Mr. Rooney was a wonderful, wonderful guy, promoter. He was a horse player. It was a gambler, kind of a. We did more horses than gambling or so. But it was a great North Side guy from Pittsburgh, and that's where he grew up. He was a promoter. He promoted boxing fights around, and so now he's got this Steeler football team, and his brother runs a sandlot football team. So when he bought the franchise, he tapped the brother on the shoulder and said, okay, we're just going to take your team and move it into the NFL since it's already organized. And he did that. His downfall was that he trusted everybody and he would hire friends to run the organization. So his coaching changes or his coaching decisions weren't necessarily the best over the years. And the results or his record showed the results of that. And then Dan Rooney, who was his eldest son, was working in the organization. And when I came in the group in 1968, Dan was kind of like a vice president, and Mr. Rooney was still running the organization. And in 1969, Dan stepped up and said, we need to take another look from a leadership role. We need to take another look, at how we approach our coaching staff. And so he took over that process and went through a process and then found a guy by the name of Chuck Noll, who was an assistant coach with the Baltimore Colts at the time. He had been out in San Diego in the American Football League for a while. And so anyway, hired him, went through the process. And so Chuck became our coach. And the interesting thing about Chuck, in comparison, if I may make it to that of Ara Parseghian, in both cases, both of them had an extreme amount of confidence in their own ability, in their knowledge of the game of football and how it should be run and how we will run it. So Coach Noll, came in and he viewed himself, and he was more of a philosopher. He was more of a teacher than maybe a coach. He needed to understand reasons why things work, how things work. And he would read about history and about leaders and not necessarily about football. One thing that he did not really is football. I mean, outside of football, it wasn't his life. And so his philosophy, over a period of time changed. And I can remember Russell. Now I'm going to take you back, and some of your listeners, Andy Russell was a captain of our football team back when I was a rookie in 1968. Andy was an all-pro linebacker for the Pittsburgh Steelers with a 2-12 record. He had been a all-pro like 3 or 4 or 5 times or 4 times on losing teams. So he was a substantial player. And so Chuck Noll comes in and he sits Andy down. And Andy thought, Chuck was going to pat him on the back for being all pro selection. And, you're the only talent that we have on this team, et cetera, from Andy's point of view. And Chuck looks at him and he said, I'm going to make you a better linebacker than you are. Now, doesn't mean that you're going to make all pro, but you're going to be a better linebacker. You have terrible technique and you take too many chances. You take too many big plays. It's not your responsibility. You will do, as I tell you, as lined up, it'll make you a more effective player and a better player for this team. But as I say, you may not make the big splash and or the make all pro. But I just wanted to tell you that's how things are going to be. And that's the way Chuck was. It's your position, and he coached everybody along those same lines about responsibility, what you do. You cannot cover for some else. You have your own responsibility. If you feel there's a weakness and you're trying to cover for the weakness, now we got 2 weaknesses on the team, on the position you just vacated and the person you're trying to help. So all of a sudden the mindset started to change and the expectations started to change and his focus on the team started to change. And he wasn't afraid to take criticism along the way, because he did that first year. He only won 1 game, the first game of the season, and then lost the next 13. But we started to draft well and prepared and get the right players in a leadership role that eventually became the core of those 70 Steelers and to win those Super Bowls. So Chuck had this. I can remember talking to Terry Hanratty. Now, Terry Hanratty, for your listeners, who was a Notre Dame player, my quarterback when I was there, and then got drafted by the Pittsburgh Steelers in 1969 in the second round. And so he had been there when Chuck came, and Chuck had picked him, and then through the years with Bradshaw in the winning years, and then so I said, so how would you describe Chuck? And so he thought and he said, listen, okay. Now Chuck was not a yeller or a screamer. He was a pretty quiet guy. I mean, didn't say a whole lot, but he just made you feel uncomfortable, and that's how he wanted his players to be. Just uncomfortable, with him. And not that Chuck, he wasn't a player's coach, I mean, he loved his players. He understood his players, but he was just reserved in that case, because he had to make decisions ultimately for the betterment of this team. And sometimes that becomes difficult when you have an emotional tie, to players specifically. So Dan Rooney had a big leadership role and part of that, if I may also say, came from Dan in my case specifically. And so when I came back from the service in 1970, I wrote a letter to Mr. Rooney, asking whether I could come back, try out for the team. And he said he'd have to talk to Dan, and they extended an invitation for me to come back in 1970. There was a players' strike at that time. Oh, and I was really concerned. I didn't want to cross the picket line. I didn't want to go in. I wanted to be a part of a veteran team, but I also know my position. So I eventually asked Andy Russell if he wouldn't mind. He was captain of the team, if I would cross the picket line and, go into training camp. And he said, yeah, go ahead and do it. So I went into training camp and went all the way through training camp. And it took its toll. And I have to tell you this, and, it beat me up training camp. And, and I thought I was in pretty good shape coming back, and just 2-a-days and, hard turf and being up at Latrobe, I was limping through practice at times and so on and so on. Eventually the story is that I get cut. Last cut. They put me on injured reserve. They cut me and I can, so the worst thing you want to ever hear in a locker room is the coach would like to see you. Oh, and bring your playbook.
Not a good thing.
It's like a kiss of death. Anyway,
yeah.
So Chuck said, we released you, go home, do what's necessary, come back, and we have an invitation, come back next year. And I was heartbroken. And so on my way home, my emotions got the best of me, and I was like, oh, what am I going to do now? What, and I started to cry. And the next morning, Dan Rooney called me, and he said, listen, he said, I apologize. He said, I wasn't there yesterday. He said, but don't worry. I talked to Chuck Noll. We're not going to take any spot up on his team, but we decided to put you on injured reserve, have our doctors take a look at you, and maybe there's something they can do. I had shrapnel working its way out of my foot at the time, and said maybe there's something they can do to help you, and maybe you can come back and towards the end of the season and help this team. So it was Dan Rooney that gave me another chance, kind of a breath of life. And so I did, and I kind of hung around that year. And the following year, they put me on the taxi squad, which was one step up. But they bought me 2 years to hang around to get better and to heal. And so they gave me a chance. And by 1972, I made the team on special teams and continued to play, and the rest becomes history thereafter. But Dan Rooney was terrific in that regard. And so it was a whole organization, that football operations in what I tell people is that the owners took care of owner business. We had no general manager in name at that time, and Chuck Noll, and Chuck took care of football business. So he was the guy that made the cuts and the decision. Ultimately, he was the one you talked to about football questions. You didn't go to a general manager talking about his organization. Owners did owner business. And so and everybody knew where they stood. And I think that becomes very important in any organizational structure, is knowing where you stand within that organization and what your responsibilities are and what you need to do to get accomplished or whatever it might be. So I think they did a wonderful job of being able to come to that kind of a model.
Wow, Rock, the names you've thrown out there, the people who have been, a key part of your life, starting with Torchy, which most people don't know, but then to Ara and Tom Pagna, Chuck Noll, Dan Rooney, and now people you're influencing in your life. Let's do another episode not too far away from here where we can deal more with your Vietnam era, your, everything that went through there. ESPN did an amazing job, John Fish, with that story, The Return. And I would encourage anybody who listens to this to go on to ESPN YouTube and look at The Return with Rocky Bleier. It's an amazing story of your Vietnam experience and going back to that. Also, your book, Fighting Back, something I gave my son when he was probably in middle school, a dog-eared paperback that he wore out. That book sits right on. I've got two go-to books on my shelf. One is that, and the other one is Endurance, the story of Shackleton's ill-fated journey to the South Pole. Those are my two go-to books. And then when I heard you do the Master of Ceremony duties at Ara's 90th birthday party up at Notre Dame, I had heard you talk a couple times, but that was and then I saw you do your one-man play. I said, this is the best speaker in America. And people throw that term around, but through your leadership league, you have a chance to motivate. So if anybody wants to reach out to Rock through the leadership league, he's great at that. Hey, thank you for this time. Give me just a final little phrase maybe for people who are out there and maybe feel like life isn't treating them right. At this day and age, maybe they need a little motivation.
Okay,
going today.
You're right. And I think it all stems on attitude and how we approach things and what we see and what we believe. And rather than why me, why not me? And so here it is. If you believe you can, you can. So just do it.
That's perfect. Rocky Bleier, appreciate it.
All right. Fine.
And Rock, we'll see you down the road.
Here are Winning Edge takeaways from the conversation with Rocky Bleier. So, Patrick, all of these, there's always more than a few, but we narrow it down a little bit here. What were your takeaways from this episode?
Well, my first takeaway is I just want to go to dinner every night with Rocky Bleier. I mean, I just love hanging around the time. Whenever I get to he's one of those guys that when you spend time with him, you just feel blessed in life to share some moments that he would share moments with me and with us and with all the coaches listening. But what comes out strongest with him is the leadership the team building. Obviously, the captain at the University of Notre Dame when they won the national championship, moves into the U.S. Army in a leadership position in Vietnam, owns his own construction business in Pittsburgh and still runs that. He talks about coaches learning from their experiences and the importance of effective leadership, not just leadership, but effective leadership. And he stressed that. And I think that's a keen difference there between just being a leader and being a leader who effectively gets the best results out of your team. He also talked a lot about preparation, and I think every coach knows that's important. We all spend a lot of time preparing practices, game plans, workouts, all schedules and things. He talked about Chuck Noll and the preparation that he had with the Steelers, and then focused on preparing your players both mentally and physically, getting that sense of discipline, and then the striving for excellence. I mean, a guy like Rocky is pretty incredible. When he came back from Vietnam after his 5 surgeries, he reiterated that how Dan Rooney told him, well, sorry about the Rock and too bad, and, wish you could have played. And Rocky said, no, I plan to play for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And Dan Rooney said, well, the doctors aren't sure you're ever going to walk without a crutch. And he said, I will do that. I will play for you. And Mr. Rooney said, if you keep working out, I'll keep paying you. And 4 years later, he was in the backfield with Franco Harris and Terry Bradshaw as they won their first of 4 Super Bowls. And Rocky was part of all those. So you talk about discipline and motivation for excellence. And then the support and encouragement is important for coaches to pass along to their assistants. He got that from Dan Rooney, the owner of the team. And he got plenty of encouragement and support. Rocky had to do the work, but then he got the support from above. And I think that's important that every coach realizes that. And listening to Rocky is just such a wonderful time.
Patrick, again, thank you for the opportunity you've given us to share these conversations here on the Coach and Coordinator podcast. And we'll be back again next week with another episode of Kileleni to the Summit. Be sure to check out our partner Global Football at globalfootball.com. And for your fundraising needs, check out Vertical Raise at verticalraise.com, an innovative platform which we'll be sharing more about here on the podcast. Follow all we're doing at coachandcoordinator.com and follow us on X at Coach K. Grabowski.